Well, one of the benefits of having a YouTube channel like this is that I do get emails and they give me ideas for videos. Matter of fact, this one says, Steve, here's an idea. So you've made up your mind to move to China. Now what? And then he lists, what about airlines, direct or indirect flights, pack entire life possessions or pack light and then buy stuff on Taobao. Lastly, how to look for a good job or school. Today, I'm going to talk about flights. Now, it might seem that you don't have much to think about when it comes to flights, but when I sat down to do the first version of this and then found out that I hadn't cleared off my cell phone yet, so it didn't save the file, I realized that I actually had a few things to talk about in this regard. Now, in terms of flying to China, post-pandemic seems to give more weight towards layovers. That is, indirect flights. You're going to be passing through a major hub and probably a secondary major hub as well. For instance, these days, I used to fly direct Beijing to Vancouver and then would have to transfer in Vancouver to my hometown. However, post-pandemic, I now have to fly Beijing to Seoul and then Seoul to Vancouver, Vancouver to my hometown of Winnipeg. This has added a few extra, not so much aggravations, but things to consider because although Seoul, and I love South Korea, don't get me wrong, it's a great place to go and it's a short flight, Beijing to South Korea. You go up, you go down, food's good, people are good, and I have some leftover Korean won. The issue with transferring through a place such as South Korea, or transferring in general, is that although you don't have to go out through security again, you still have to go through security. And this kind of bothers me a little bit because it depends on what you bring with you. If you are just carrying a backpack, then it's going to be pretty easy for you. But if you have something like, I don't know, a laptop and an iPad and a couple of cameras and possibly a drone, then this might get a little bit annoying having to pack and unpack those things a couple times along the way. So that's one issue with flying indirect or having layovers throughout your itinerary or throughout your journey here. The other thing is that although this is not a big concern flying to China because all the major hubs, especially coming from North America, are, I guess what you would call pretty standard. There's Vancouver, there's Los Angeles, there's San Francisco, and then of course there's Taipei and even Hong Kong, and then Seoul and Tokyo. Now, out of all of those, I typically avoid flying through the United States for no other reason than simply I've heard so many different stories about flights being delayed, luggage being lost, that I haven't heard the same stories from people who've flown through either Canadian carriers or Asian carriers in the area. So that's typically why I avoid going through the United States. Not only that, there seems to be a bit of I guess the United States has such an, what would you call it? An airborne population. That is, a lot of people take flights all the time. Not like Canada. Canada, you wouldn't be taking flights a lot of places. You'd probably be driving quite a few places. If it's like Winnipeg to Saskatoon, you might drive instead of take a flight. Whereas in the United States, there seems to be a little bit more of a take a flight instead of driver. So that adds to airport congestion. And that's something that I kind of try to minimize, even though I know I'm flying through some major international hubs along the way. Other than that, the other thing to consider with a layover is whether or not it's worth it. And by that, I mean two things: time and money. So do you have more time than money, or do you have more money than time? It's great to think that you can have a layover, and especially in my situation where I have a brother and his family who lives in Vancouver, I'd like to see them every now and then, and it's difficult to get that when I book only one ticket. That is, a ticket from Beijing to my hometown. Trying to gauge a flight or a series of flights with the appropriate length of a layover gets very difficult. So as a result, I end up having to book if 2 or 3 legs of the flight of the itinerary in different parts. That is, I go Beijing to Seoul and then Seoul to Vancouver. That's one series. And then from Vancouver to my hometown. On the way back, it would be, usually it's Winnipeg to Vancouver to Seoul to Beijing. Way back, again, I wouldn't stop over in Vancouver. I'd just go right through. Do you want to lay over? Do you need to lay over in a city? And if you have more time, do you have the money to do that? Because that brings up a second point, that if you do lay over, it's going to cost money. If you don't have someone to stay with, such as a family member or a friend, you might have to stay, if not at the airport hotel, then at a hotel or a hostel somewhere else. Now, this might sound like a great grand adventure and awesome, good on you. I wish you all the best with this. One thing about doing this sort of travel itinerary is that hotels, those prices can add up. Hostels, those are good, but then you might not get this, the quality sleep that you want when you're on such a length of journey. Not only that, one thing that I consider when I'm looking at a lengthy layover or an adventurous layover to a place such as, Amsterdam, theft, security, loss, not just of my luggage, but of my passport. And in a country like China, where basically your employment hinges on a sticker in your passport, this is something that goes through my mind when I'm looking at these types of layovers. It's not to say that this is a big issue, but if you lose your visa to China, you're going to have issues. And no, they don't accept photocopies as proof. With all that being said, indirect or direct flights, direct flights are very expensive these days. Again, post-pandemic seems to be lending itself more to indirect flights. You might be able to make a trip of it as long as you're being cost conscious, time conscious, and of course, safe with your belongings. Are there any good particular transfer cities that, in particular? This will come down to where you're transferring. I know a lot of people who transfer through London, and there's either Heathrow or Gatwick. There seems to be a bit of a reputation in there. Charles de Gaulle has a bit of a reputation as well. Contrast that with Seoul Incheon Airport. Very good transfer experience. Same with Vancouver. Very good transfer experience. Hong Kong. I'm not sure if you have to go through immigration. You might have to because it's considered part of the mainland and you can do all of the... So instead of going through customs here in Beijing, you would go through those in Hong Kong instead. So that might be something to consider if you're flying to the mainland of China rather than just transferring through Hong Kong on your way to another destination. So time and cost are two big decisions to consider when you're considering whether you're going to take an indirect flight or direct flight to China. The other thing is you might not have a choice because if you have to be somewhere, you might just have to swallow the more expensive ticket rather than taking the more leisurely, cheaper, adventurous, long way around. It's not just hotels or safety, it's also the amount of money it would cost. For example, if the indirect flight is $400 cheaper, but you're stopping over in a city that's going to cost you $500 to stay over for the night, and you're not going to get much more than, a hotel stay, then you might want to consider whether it's just simply better to fly right through rather than laying over, or having a shorter layover in the airport rather than having an adventurous layover in the city. So time and cost are two things to consider. Now, in doing that, where would I find indirect flights? I do a lot of my flight shopping on a site called CheapoAir.ca, and this is the Canadian version of this very large flight aggregator that I faintly recall hearing from some lady in South Korea when we were all out drinking together, and it's stuck with me ever since then. But this CheapoAir is similar to Skyscanner, and there was another flight aggregator years ago that used to be popular. Same, but different. CheapoAir, like Skyscanner, has various regional or national versions of its websites, so it can send different versions or send different flight deals to you depending on all sorts of factors. If you want to go pure blood Chinese instead, there's 3 other websites that people are using. I use Fliggy, Feiju, Flying Pig. That's one of the popular ones. I think it's owned by Taobao or owned by Alibaba. The other one is Qunar, and then also Ctrip. And I'm not even sure if those are the same company, just different products. Qunar being one of the Chinese version that services the mainland of China, whereas Ctrip services the world, basically. Likewise, Fliggy, as far as I know, is all in Chinese, and I'm not sure if they have an English version. The good thing about these 3, in particular, Qunar, Ctrip, and Fliggy, is that they offer me, at least, an opportunity to pay with Alipay or WeChat. That is cash in the bank here in China, rather than putting it onto a Canadian credit card. And this might not be a big deal for somebody, especially if they have, cash flow in North America, but for some expats, it becomes an issue where you pay for something on a Canadian credit card or an American credit card, but then you have to make those payments. Now, the nature of credit cards is that if you don't pay it immediately, they have no problem loaning you a little bit more money at 24% interest. So keep that in mind. Not only that, to send money from China to the United States or to Canada will incur transfer costs as well. So again, this is something that might be sort of tangential to think about, but would you use your international credit card or would you use your domestic cash in bank rather than putting it on a credit instead? So CheapoAir, Skyscanner, Qunar, Ctrip, and Fliggy are sort of the 5 big ones that I know of. Of those 5, I use CheapoAir and Fliggy the most. The other thing you can do is look at the company websites themselves. That is, for me, it would be Air China. I check prices there. Air Canada is one that I fly quite a bit. And then also what you could do is look at CheapoAir.ca or .com, find out which airlines are flying the legs of the trip that you want, and then go check the airline websites themselves. Sometimes what I have found is that the reason why the CheapoAir are substantially cheaper than the airline website is because they might not offer the same luggage services. That is, they might be excluding carry-on luggage, how many checked bags you can take, or even whether or not the ticket is refundable or even get points. Typically with CheapoAir and Skyscanner, you're giving up the points. If you're booking through the company website itself, such as Air China or Air Canada, especially like Star Alliance or whatever the other one is, those ones will give you points. Now, a word about points. Don't worry about them. I know a lot of people, this is a huge thing in North America. Get your points. Make sure you get the points. The points are only good particularly if, I don't know, you're a farmer and you have massive purchases all the time and you have to put them on a credit card because there's really just no other way that you can pay for those things as often as you need to. Likewise, any sort of company or anybody who has recurring purchases that they need to make, utility payments, for example, not so much that you don't have the cash, but you're able to defer that payment for a little bit using the credit card and then accumulate these points as well. But don't go chasing these points to fly international. To me, not worth the hassle, not worth the time, not worth the stress. On top of that, with those points, typically you can only fly at certain times on certain days. I prefer the flexibility of just buying a cheaper ticket whenever I want to go rather than having the system generate a points appropriate flight itinerary for me. Who do I normally fly with? I normally fly with Air Canada, but Air Canada associates itself with Air China. The last time I checked it, it was 25,000 renminbi or 40,000 renminbi to do this flight, Beijing to Vancouver with Air Canada or with Air China. It was just stupidly expensive, and I was like, no way is it worth it to do that. I'd rather take the train back. It's not even possible. But I usually fly Air Canada, who teams up with Air China or Korean Air, and that gives me the Star Alliance points, which again, not a huge deal, but I have actually got an oven out of it before, a tabletop oven. So thank you, Air China, thank you, Star Alliance. No sponsorship. So Air Canada will team up with Air China. Air China will fly me from Beijing to Seoul, and that's where Air Canada will pick me up. Seoul to Vancouver, and then Vancouver to Winnipeg. Now I can't remember if flying through Vancouver, since it's your first point of contact with Canada, if you have to pick up your luggage. This is something that you have to check before you book your ticket, because sometimes they will offer you a shorter layover, so you want to make sure that that goes all smoothly. Now, I know that if I fly from Canada to Beijing, it's all checked all the way through. But if I'm flying from Beijing to Vancouver, I might have to pick up my luggage, and I can't remember which one it is. So double check that just to make sure. Other than Air Canada, I have flown Air China quite a bit, and they're very good. Also flown Korean Air. The thing about the Asian airlines is that typically all of the flight attendants are under the age of 26. So take that for what it is. That being said, Air Canada usually had very good service. The food has been very good as well. They have a good flight safety record. Likewise with Korean Air. The last time I flew Korean Air was in November of 2024. I had the whole row to myself. They also gave me slippers, which I thought was very good, but the food was okay, edible. Most importantly, I didn't get sick. Now, Air Canada, every time I've flown Air Canada, that flight is full. Vancouver to Seoul, Vancouver to Beijing, every time I've taken that Pacific flight, it's full. So if that tells you anything about the quality, the standards, I don't know, but you could look at something like Korean Air, which didn't have a full flight when I flew on it in November. Now, that's not to say that it always happens. It might have also been the time of year. Likewise, with Air China, China Eastern and China Southern, I've flown those within the country, within China itself, and they're good. I mean, again, most of the Chinese airlines have, maybe it's a rule, an unwritten rule, have a sort of a requisite saying that you have to be under the age of 26 to work as a flight attendant. That aside, China's air safety record is superb. They've had a major incident a couple of years ago, which you can look into yourself and decide for yourself what happened. But that aside, wonderful. I mean, even when you go through the airport in Beijing, you will be shocked at how efficient and good it is. I mean, the food offerings might not be so good sometimes, but airport security, amazing. Some of these other airlines, like there's Air China, China Southern, China Eastern, Hainan, and there's one or two others that might actually fly international. I know Hainan flies from not Beijing, but other major cities in China to places like Edmonton or to Calgary or to other secondary major cities in parts of North America and Europe. So if you can't find something with, a big carrier such as Air Canada or Air China, it might pay to look into some of these sort of not as well known airplane carrier airlines. There we go. The one transfer I wanted to do, but I never did, was from Beijing through Amsterdam to Edmonton, and that was just after the pandemic had ended with KLM. And the reviews seemed to be pretty good, and it was cheap. It was like $2,000 or $2,200 Canadian to fly round trip Beijing all the way to Canada and then back again. You're going, why was it so cheap? One of the reasons is because it was a 20-hour layover in Amsterdam, which this isn't something you might want to consider. If you're going to do one of these adventurous layovers, what are you carrying with you? And this doesn't have to be bad things. What I'm saying is that for me, sometimes I'm carrying gifts for my nieces and nephews, and I would rather just give them to them rather than have that chance of loss or of theft or something, or simply not arriving on time when I get to Canada. Likewise, on my return trip, usually I'm bringing stuff back with me, some things that maybe I either can't get in China or things that I can get here, but sometimes you can get them cheaper in Canada. Supplements comes to mind. You can usually get, if you go to a place like Shoppers Drug Mart or Safeway or any one of these sort of supplement companies, sometimes they have deals on where you can buy bulk and you can buy on discount, which means that you can get more of it in North America rather than buying it at what would seem to be a higher price here in China. So again, CheapoAir, Skyscanner, Tunar, Ctrip, and Fliggy. Some offer the ability to use an international credit card. Some offer the ability to use Alipay or WeChat. You can also check major airlines such as Air Canada or Korean Air or Air China for deals as well. And again, don't worry about the points. I think they're a little bit overrated. I did mention that I tend to shy away from flying through the States. As a result, I don't have as much experience with the American airlines than some of my colleagues would, whether it be Delta, United. I mean, some of those airlines sure get a lot of coverage with tires falling off and doors blowing out. But there were two major flight incidents, the one in Kazakhstan and the one in Korea. So this is something to be, of course, it sits in the back of your mind, but don't try to think about it too much. As for where to sit in the airplane, let me tell you the best place to sit is wherever you want to sit. Wherever you feel comfortable. The one thing I like to do is I usually like to get the window seat on international flights because it's just a lot easier. And that also means you have to moderate your liquid intake before and during the flight. Afterwards, go to town. Now, one thing about drinking alcohol in these flights, I've started to stop drinking. I don't drink as much on these international flights as I used to. One, I know it's free, but not only does it dehydrate you, I find that if I don't drink on the flight or simply don't drink during the period of travel, that is that 1 week or 2 weeks before and after the trip, then I'm able to do a lot more, not just on less sleep, but I also feel a lot better in general. Don't get me wrong, jet lag's going to get you. Hard to beat it. Stay hydrated, stay active, go for a run, and eventually your body will catch up with what's going on. So we've got time. How long do you have? Do you have to be in your destination sooner than later? Or do you have more money or less money and you can afford the time? Is it going to cost more to lay over in the city rather than taking a direct flight? Or will it be cheaper to spend some extra time or more worth it to stay in a city or even just in an airport overnight rather than taking a more direct flight? Of course, flight safety is always a concern. I like to fly Air Canada. They have a pretty good flight safety record. The United States Airlines, I'm sure they've had their incidences over time. But of course, the major incidences over the last few years, if you remember the Boeing Maxes that had some issues, The one thing is that if you look at those two incidences and read some of the reports or some of the comments from other pilots around the world, is that it comes down to a lot of pilot awareness of what to do in that situation. You might say, no duh. Well, the situation basically was that these flights, these Boeing Maxes, were more automated than older planes. But some of the pilots weren't aware of what to do when they couldn't override the automated system. Now, I'll let you do the research into it. All I want you to do is that when you're thinking about flight safety is to consider not just your point of departure, but also what airline you're flying as well, if it's a concern to you. My major concern with flight safety is usually between secondary cities rather than primary cities. Now, by primary cities, I mean the big ones: Hong Kong, London, Paris, Beijing, Seoul, Vancouver, those ones, the big international hubs. The secondary cities, the ones where you're flying regional to regional, that's where I would be a little bit more, I guess, aware of the flight safety record of the airlines involved. Again, I wouldn't stress about this too much. I know people say that flying is the safest way to transport around the world. The issue is that when there's an incident, as we're supposed to do, pay, knock on wood, all the best, and ilu ping an, as they say in Chinese, which is have a safe journey. Other than time and cost and flight safety, food. Honestly, I'm not too picky of an eater, and again, this might be a little bit more of a concern on secondary routes than major international routes, and that is, what is the food like on these airplanes? My dad told me many, many years ago that I should eat before getting on an airplane for the singular reason that you don't know how long you're going to be on the tarmac. This is also another reason why I tend to avoid flying through the United States. They seem to have more of an issue with delays. Now, this could be for any reason. I don't really know. Again, I don't fly through the States very often, mainly because I live in China and I'm flying to Canada rather than through the United States. But that being said, is it worth it to spend the $20 or $30 on a meal in the airport rather than waiting to get onto the airplane? I say spend the money at the airport so that way you're taken care of until whenever the flight actually takes off and you're fed the first of however many meals they're actually going to give you. Again, this is where I have to give props to Air Canada. The food's usually pretty good, haven't gotten sick, and desserts are usually good, and I kind of consider that to be one of the standard bearers of quality because if the dessert's good, generally the meal's good as well. Not only that, they have snacks at the back of the airplane when you are flying, so you can go back there and stuff your face full of tuna sandwiches or the cookies. So overall, time, how much of it do you have? Do you need to be there faster, or can you take your time? Cost, do you have the money to pay for the ticket? And here's something else to consider. Is the company going to pay for it? And how much are they going to cover of that flight? Number 3, flight safety. Who are you flying with? And should you be concerned about who's flying the airplane? And number 4, the food. I mean, again, this could be food on the airplane or in the airports that are available to you. All right, folks, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. If you found this video useful, give it a thumbs up. It tells the YouTube algo that I'm doing something right. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe, follow along for more adventure-related videos in China and around the world. And also, if you have any comments or suggestions or any tips or advice for people who travel around the world, please drop us a comment. Would love to hear from you and see what your experience has been and some of the travel wisdom that you've gained over time. Thanks again. We'll do this again. Have a good one. Bye-bye.